This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 914 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the transactions this week, I want to remind you to check out Underdog Fantasy. Underdog is a great place to play fantasy sports with so many different offerings that will definitely fit what you're looking for. Right now, if you sign up on Underdog, you'll get a nice deposit offer, a free pick that'll help you win some cash, and then also my rest of season rankings. And then on Tuesday, for what it's worth, there's a site-wide Patrick Mahomes free pick promo. So you can get that if you sign up. But those rest of season rankings, they're updated every Tuesday through the end of the season. You get access to all of those updates. So make sure to take advantage of the offers. Just head to underdogfantasy.com and sign up. And when you do, use promo code LATEROUND. Let's get to these 15 transactions. Add Jaan Jennings. So keep in mind that with this 15 transactions episode, and with the write-up that I do in the newsletter, I try to not repeat transactions week after week. I've talked about Bucky Irving for a couple of weeks now. I'm not going to bring him up on today's show, because I want to try and stay one step ahead of the competition. I want to give you guys other recommendations. But sometimes things do need to be repeated. When you get a performance like what we saw with Jaan Jennings in week 3, I've got to talk about it again. Because he scored 46.5 freaking PPR points this past week. Now, I talked about Jennings last week as an ad. I never thought that he was going to do this. I never thought that he was going to see a 40% target share for the 49ers. Now, obviously, Deebo Samuel and George Kittle being sidelined helped Jennings' cause. Jennings and Brandon Aiyuk combined for a 73.3% target share in week 3. But at the moment, there's no telling when those guys might return. We might be able to get another usable week out of Jennings here in week 4, so he needs to be rostered everywhere. Buy Brandon Aiyuk. So while Jaan Jennings dominated for the 49ers this past week, Brandon Aiyuk not so much. Aiyuk finished the game against the Rams with just 9.8 PPR points. He's now failed to hit a double-digit PPR point total in each of his first 3 games. Anyone who used a top 3 round pick or a top 4 round pick on Brandon Aiyuk is not very happy right now. But I'm willing to cut him a little bit of a break. He had a weird ramp up to the season because of that contract dispute. And even on Sunday, despite his poor performance, he had a 33.3% target share. On the year, according to PFF's expected fantasy points model, Aiyuk has played roughly 4 PPR points per game below expectation. Sometimes production just doesn't match the peripherals. And that's going to especially be true when you get the ramp up, like I said, like Brandon Aiyuk had. Like at the end of the day, we have a lot of historical data that tells us that Brandon Aiyuk is a good player. You might be able to buy his talent for a low price right now. Not only is he coming off this disappointing performance, but players like George Kittle and Deebo Samuel, they're not going to be out forever. Their eventual return is going to make Aiyuk managers even more nervous. They're going to be more afraid that Aiyuk is not going to see a high target share. But I'm willing to bet on the talent right now. So I'm willing to buy Brandon Aiyuk for a lower price than we drafted him for. Add Braylon Allen. Braylon Allen's carving out a role in this Jets offense. He didn't see that much work in week 1. He had a sub 6% running back rush share. But over his last 2 games, those rush shares have been 33% and 37%. And with the Jets playing in such a favorable script in week 3, that meant that the running backs saw a lot of work. He ended that game with 11 rush attempts. Now, Braylon Allen's not about to take Breece Hall's job. As much as I like Allen, my Zap model really liked Allen coming out. And he's definitely not a threat to take Breece Hall's receiving work. Hall ran 25 routes in week 3. Braylon Allen only had 8. But the Jets rank first right now in the NFL in running back target share. And Braylon Allen, at worst, is one of the best handcuffs in fantasy football. Keep in mind, among all running backs in this past year's draft class, Allen had the best breakout score. That's a metric that goes into the Zap model. He should be rostered in way more than 36% of Yahoo leagues. Sell Garrett Wilson. Now, I would imagine that Garrett Wilson's going to be a popular buy candidate this week. And I can't blame anyone who wants to go out and buy him. If you were to show me Garrett Wilson's current profile in a vacuum, his production, his peripherals, his talent, I'd almost definitely call him a buy. And you can actually still do that depending on where your team is sitting. Now, let me explain. Wilson's definitely underperformed thus far. He's averaging 12.2 PPR points per game, which is not special, but he has a target share above 28%. That's not far off from what we saw last year. And with Aaron Rodgers at quarterback, especially the Aaron Rodgers that we saw this past Thursday, why wouldn't we buy? The reason is the schedule. Over the Jets' next 4 games, they get the Broncos, Vikings, Bills, and Steelers. According to my adjusted fantasy points allowed method, no team wide receivers have a tougher 4-game stretch than the Jets. Garrett Wilson has already faced some tough cornerbacks. And there's some matchups over the next month that are going to be just as difficult. So this is one of those transactions that needs some context. If you're sitting at 3-0 and you've got Garrett Wilson, or if you're in a league where the Wilson manager, they're just over it, they're willing to trade him away for less than what he was drafted for, you actually could argue trading for him. I think we're going to see a lot of Garrett Wilson production during the second half of the season. This transaction, the sell transaction for Garrett Wilson, is for the teams out there, which might be a lot of Garrett Wilson teams given how he's produced, but it's the teams out there who are 0-3 or 1-2, who are struggling a lot, who maybe could use the information that's out there by analysts who are saying buy Garrett Wilson to actually sell him at a reasonable price. As much as I want to say go buy him because the peripherals are there and he's a really great wide receiver, I still have to ground myself and realize that this schedule coming up is not very fun. If you can get past this schedule, he should be great though. Add Clyde EdwardsAir. So in week 3, Kansas City's running back deployment, it was pretty expected. Maybe Carson Steele saw a little bit more work than anticipated, but he was the early down bruiser. Samaje Perine was the pass catching back. It wasn't something crazy. It's not like we saw one of those two guys become a bell cow. Now, Clyde EdwardsAir has been sidelined as he deals with PTSD. We don't know for sure if and when he's going to return to this lineup. But Mike Tirico on Sunday night, he mentioned that CEH could return to the team soon, possibly as early as week 5. He said, quote, talking to the Chiefs tonight, they think they'll get EdwardsAir back, perhaps for game 5 of the season when he's eligible to return. And shout out to Fantasy Alarm for that report. Now, the likely outcome for this backfield is that it's an absolute mess, just an absolute disaster. The Chiefs signed Kareem Hunt last week. Keontae Ingram's there. It's a mess. But plenty of you are in deeper formats. And plenty of you need some help. So don't be afraid to add CEH this week. Buy Romeo Douglas. So Jordan Love seems really, really close to finally getting back to that Packers lineup. That would obviously change the offense's dynamic completely. Over their last 2 games, Green Bay has had drop back over expected rates, according to Fantasy Life, of minus 25% and minus 12%. They were plus 3% in week 1, because in week 1, they had Jordan Love. Now, everyone is going to be rightfully excited about Jaden Reed when Jordan Love returns. But don't sleep on Romeo Douglas either. He's led the Packers in routes run in all 3 games this year. And there's a chance that you could just get him off of someone's bench. Maybe they're not recognizing how good his peripherals have actually been. And it might not be that hard to get him because he hasn't had really great performances this year. I think Romeo Douglas is honestly one of the best buys this week. Drop Ezekiel Elliott. Now look, anytime I give advice about dropping a player, you've got to put your league into context. You've got to understand your own individual league. There are some formats where letting go of Ezekiel Elliott is a bad idea. In deeper formats, he should probably still be held. But in a 10-team league, maybe even a 12-team league, with a normal-sized bench, you could easily argue that that roster spot should be used for someone else. Elliott has seen his backfield share drop every single week this year. His 52% running back rush share in week 1 was totally fine, but that's now fallen to 23%. His snap share has done the exact same thing. It went from 50% in week 1, it was 20% in week 3. We might have some usability at times from Ezekiel Elliott this year. But as long as everyone's healthy in that backfield, why should we believe that Elliott's going to be the guy who emerges, who becomes some workhorse? It's not like he's better off with a teammate injury than like 95% of the backup running backs in the league. I would rather have a handcuff than Ezekiel Elliott. Like, you might not get the same production out of Trey Benson, let's say, but there's a lot more upside for Benson than there is for Zeke Elliott. And he's still rostered in 67% of Yahoo leagues. I think that he can be safely dropped in most of those. And if Rico Dowdle's available, he's the back that you should want out of that Cowboys backfield. Buy the Chicago Bears passing attack. It really shouldn't take that much to get Caleb Williams right now. He threw his first touchdown pass in week 3. He's been below 8 fantasy points in 2 of his 3 games this year. And Shane Waldron, Chicago's offensive coordinator, has been horrible. But you have to just hope that adjustments are coming. And you have to hope that Caleb Williams just simply develops as a passer. But there are some good things here. The first thing is that Caleb Williams actually ranks as a QB1 right now in expected fantasy points. That's according to PFF's model. He should be closer to 18.1 points per game. He's been about 6 points below that. And yeah, it's because he hasn't played that well, but he's also a rookie quarterback. He hypothetically should be able to develop as the season goes on. But here's the second reason I'm intrigued. Upcoming for Chicago are games against the Rams, Panthers, Jags, and Commanders. None of those teams are scaring us from a matchups perspective. It's arguably the best next 4 schedule of any team passing attack. So if you're struggling at quarterback, maybe you want some sort of platoon, you could look at Caleb Williams. But then don't forget to get a feel for how the DJ Moore, the Rome Odunze, maybe even the Keenan Allen manager feels about those guys in your league. Because the pass catchers in Chicago, they should benefit from this upcoming schedule too. Add Cole Kmet. So let's go to one of the pass catchers in the Bears and Cole Kmet because he had a big week 3 performance. Yes, it was helped because Keenan Allen was sidelined, but this coaching staff is using their tight ends differently. They've been a pretty irrational staff so far this year, but at least they're being semi-rational with their tight ends. Because if you remember, in week 1, Gerald Everett ran more routes than Kmet. Kmet was basically a drop candidate at that point. But things have shifted, thankfully. They're using the young, talented pass catcher. Kmet saw a season-high 71% route participation in week 3. Gerald Everett, 21%. That resulted in a season-high 24% target share for Kmet. Now, that likely is not going to continue when Keenan Allen is back, that type of target share. But right now, the tight end position, it's really weak, and Kmet is still out there in 60% of Yahoo leagues. So he definitely should be added. Add Roschon Johnson. So I'll go with one more Chicago Bear before we move on. DeAndre Swift has been really bad this year. According to Next Gen Stats, he's dead last in rushing yards over expected per rush, and he's dead last with an 18.9% success rate. And Chicago seems to be noticing. In week 3, his running back rush share fell to 52%. That was a season low. His route participation also fell to a season low of 50%. And that led to another game with a sub 10% target share. That's the second time that's happened this year for Swift. That's his bread and butter. If DeAndre Swift is going to be a viable fantasy asset, he needs to catch passes out of the backfield. But that's not happening right now. And he's been really bad on the ground. And then you look at Roschon Johnson. He played 38% of Chicago's snaps, and he ran a route on 38% of Chicago's dropbacks. Khalil Herbert had a 10% snap share in week 3. Now, Herbert's always been really good on the ground, but he's also had a lot of question marks as a receiver. That's the main reason he hasn't been an amazing fantasy asset. Roschon Johnson at least has a 3-down skill set. That's why I'm giving him some love on today's list. There's a chance that this was the start for a major shift in the Bears' backfield. Buy Mike Evans. So this Buccaneers offense so far this year has been the Chris Godwin show. Godwin scored in every game, and he has 10 more targets than teammate Mike Evans. Evans has now had back-to-back bad games. He had 7.2 PPR points in week 2, and he caught just 2 passes for 17 yards in week 3. But now is not the time to panic. Evans still had a 32% target share in week 2. In week 3, he saw shutdown corner Patrick Surtain. Evans lined up against Surtain on 24 of 32 coverage snaps. Surtain is one of the best corners in the league. Now, Godwin's a legit asset to have this season, but we should expect these 2 wide receivers to meet in the middle a little bit more moving forward. Add add Darnell Mooney. Look, it's clear at this point that Darnell Mooney has a real role in this Falcons offense. And it's not that surprising because they don't have that much depth at pass catcher. But Mooney has had a really solid last couple of weeks. He had target shares of 24% and 30% over those two games. Atlanta's tried their best to establish the run. They've had a pass rate over expected below 0 in each of their first 3 games, but even still, a 24% target share, a 30% target share for a relatively talented player, that shouldn't be sitting on the waiver wire. Buy Rasheed Shaheed. So after such a good start to the season, Rashid Shaheed fell back to earth in week 3. He scored 0 fantasy points. And a lot of people are already pointing to the fact that this is just what Rashid Shaheed is. He's a deep threat. He either connects with a deep bomb or he doesn't. And when he doesn't, he is absolute toast in fantasy football. Now that's true to some extent, but this is not the same Rashid Shaheed as what we saw in 2022 and 2023. Despite the game that he had in week 3, he still hit a 21.7% target share. He's now been over a 20% target share in every game this year. He hit that mark just twice last season. And his 51% air yard share this past week, that was actually a season high. He just couldn't convert. Only 20% of his targets were catchable. That's according to PFF. Now, the Saints don't have the easiest short-term schedule according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. But from now through the end of the year, they have a top 5 schedule for wide receivers. So see if you can trade for Rashid Shaheed because his role is a lot bigger than it was last year and the year before that. Add Sam Darnold. Sam Darnold is the only quarterback in the NFL this year to have multiple touchdowns in every game played. This week he gets Green Bay. It's not a great matchup on paper, but there could be more of a back and forth game with Jordan Love potentially back. Now, Darnold does have some touchdown regression coming. His touchdown rate is currently 10.3%. But he's in a good system. He's got an alpha wide receiver. And keep in mind, Darnold's doing all of this without TJ Hawkinson and without Jordan Addison. So he's not a bad play this week, but he also has long-term value. And if you need another quarterback streamer, if he's out there, look at Geno Smith. He's in a good spot this week against the Lions. Add the Las Vegas Raiders defense. So far this year, Cleveland's been the second most advantageous matchup for defenses according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. They've given up the 4th highest pressure rate in the entire league, and they've been 4th worst in EPA per play. They get the Raiders this week, and it's in a game that has the 2nd lowest game total on the slate. Cleveland's got offensive line issues. This is the right opponent for Vegas to get back on track. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll be back tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trends episode. I'll talk to you then.